Hello, the Conformist. I want to begin my analysis today by calling attention to the challenges that the film's continual shifts back and forth in time present for the viewer. We receive pieces of information about Marcello's past not in the sequence they occurred in his life, but as he recalls them associatively. As a result, key events that explain Marcello's situation in Paris and the diegetic present, such as his adolescent sexual encounter with Lino, come to us in delayed fashion. These delayed disclosures, when we see them, require us to look back and interpret earlier scenes in the film with this new knowledge that we've acquired in mind. A helpful way to understand the demands that Bertolucci's scrambling of time places on the viewer is a distinction that we find in literary studies between what are called fabula and sujet. Fabula means story. It refers to the chronological sequence in which events actually occurred in the world of the novel or the film. These events could be plotted on a timeline showing cause and effect. But sujet is the order in which the events come to the reader or the viewer. This is the plot rather than the story. Now, in many films, most perhaps, the story and the plot, the fabula and the sujet, are virtually identical. But when there is a discrepancy, as in The Conformist, the viewer must do two things in the process of interpretation. First, we must create a timeline of our own out of the disordered achronological fragments we're given to make sense of the story. And second, as I've noted, we must revisit earlier scenes in the film and understand them in light of what we learn later. In this respect, the film presents the viewer with a classic instance of what's called the hermeneutic circle. The interpretive circle goes like this. We can only understand the whole film by seeing all of its parts, but we can only fully understand any particular part or scene once we have a knowledge of the whole. Practically speaking, this means we really have to watch the film twice. When we last saw Marcello, he was recalling a visit to his fiancée Giulia's house in Rome. He soon learns that an anonymous letter has arrived warning Giulia's family against allowing her to marry Marcello because his father is in an insane asylum allegedly due to syphilis that has gone to his brain. Marcello rejects this latter claim, but he pays a visit to the old man, who is indeed in a mental institution. And Marcello goes to fetch, on the way, his eccentric mother. She must accompany him. The old woman lives in the decaying mansion where Marcello grew up. The house is the antithesis of Julius's shiny drawing room, and it represents the abnormal upbringing that Marcello is trying to bury under a veil of conformity. Have a look at two moments from this uncomfortable return home.
Insomma, chi siete? Perché mi seguite?
Pura coincidenza. Non seguivo voi. Evidentemente andiamo tutti e due allo stesso posto. Permettete una domanda. Mi chiamate per caso Clerici?
Sì, sono il dottor Clerici. E voi chi siete?
Agenti di servizio.
Per piacere, copriti. Non mi va di vederti mezza nuda.
Ah, che figlio moralista mi ritrovo. Sai, ho fatto un sogno. Entravi da quella porta, ti sedevi sul mio letto e mi davi un bacio.
Beh, non ti vesti?
Che ora è?
È tardi, non andiamo a trovare papà?
Ma perché non muore? Risparmieremmo i soldi della clinica. Ne ho così pochi.
Vendi la macchina.
No, la macchina non la vendo. Significherebbe licenziare Alberi. E a me non va di mandarlo via. Mi sento così sola in questa casa. E poi voglio vederlo quando mi pare, oh.
Posso pregarti di non parlarmi dei tuoi amanti?
I miei amanti. Ne ho uno solo. Ed ha più charme di quella gallina della tua fidanzata. Che ruffiano che sei. Ah, no, no. La macchina non la vendo. Vendo la casa. Voglio girare l'Europa. Alberi è nato per viaggiare. E Roma è diventata così provinciale, i figli dei parioli che si sposano a Viale delle Milizie, ma che va che tu c'ha da via i ciao.
Agente in servizio speciale Manganiello.
Presente.
Vi sembra una casa normale questa? Per della gente normale?
Il colonnello mi ha incaricato di dirvi che
Per un'infanzia normale? Questa decadenza mi dà la nausea. Manganiello.
Sì, dottore.
Camerata. La vedete questa? È morfina.
Ah,
Che vuole il colonnello?
c'è un piccolo cambiamento di programma. Andando a Parigi, prima di passare la frontiera, vi fermerete a 20 miglia, via dei Glicini, numero 3.
E cosa c'è al numero 3 di via dei Glicini?
Vi presenterete al fiduciario Raoul. Lui vi darà le ultime istruzioni.
Da quanto tempo siete nei ranghi?
Dal 1923. Turchia, Francia, Africa,
Sempre
Grecia.
sulla breccia?
Mai fermo, dottore. Tutto per la famiglia e per la patria.
La patria avanti alla famiglia.
Signor sì, dottore.
Camerata.
Marcello's journey to the home of his slovenly, drug-addicted mother is presented as a tracking shot at an acutely tilted angle. The shot itself is unconventional, contrary to classic cinematic practice, and it's used here expressionistically to reflect Marcello's feelings about his mother. He regards her lifestyle as dangerously distorted, perverse, out of keeping, out of kilter with the normal world of horizontal lines, if you will. Always fearful of how others might see him, Marcello feels he's being followed here, always looking over his shoulder. And he is being followed by Manganiello, a fascist agent who introduces himself at the gate. He's been assigned to assist Marcello on his upcoming trip to Paris and his meeting with Quadri. Manganiello tells him that the new instructions have come down and that he must stop on the way to Paris on his honeymoon at the Italian seaside town of Ventimiglia in order to get the details of the changes from a fascist named Raoul. Inside the house, Marcello is disgusted at the decadence and the squalor. His mother shares her bed with a litter of little dogs, and he finds a morphine vial beneath the bed. There's no affection here on either side. His first words are an order to cover up her half-naked body, and we recall Marcello covering the sleeping Julia at the start of the film in the hotel. Unclothed bodies disgust him, as does most sexuality. Marcello finds his mother's relationship with her Asian chauffeur, Hemlock, to be indecent. The man is both her drug supplier and her lover. Marcello is embarrassed that the fascist agent, Manganiello, sees this family corruption, and he tries to dissociate himself from it in order to prove his devotion to the fascist movement. Thus, he tells Manganiello that the house itself makes him nauseous. He holds out a morphine bottle as evidence and declares that none of this is normal. He does this standing rigidly, almost in a fascist salute. Marcello calls Manganiello a comrade and repeats the word normal to affirm that middle-class normality and fascist hygiene are what he craves. Similarly, he told Julia's mother that he would go to a doctor to attest to his real mental health, his normality. Well, Marcello is ashamed of both his parents, but his rejection of his mother's sexual appetite and his repudiation of his father's madness are excessive. And ironically, these extreme attempts to appear normal by repudiating his parents only reveal Marcello's own mental instability. It is the insanity of one who would deny his entire past, repress his entire psychosexual nature, betray a man he admired, and even participate in a murder, all in an effort to fit in. In doing these things, Marcello inadvertently also exposes the inherent madness of the repressive fascist regime that he wishes to embrace. While Marcello harbors a secret contempt for bourgeois mediocrity, he despises his mother's aristocratic corruption far more. He would like to wash himself of all connections to it. The camera work and lighting here emphasize the strangeness and perversity that he experiences in his mother's domain. When she gets up, for example, the camera pans 180 degrees to follow her out of the dark bedroom and into the lighted bathroom, passing across the wall that separates them, and it then follows her back from the bathroom into the dark bedroom. This extended tracking shot across two rooms defies normal cinematic practice that would use an editing cut to mark that passage. Instead, Bertolucci's camera creates a dreamlike or drug-induced fluidity that erases the boundaries between the rooms. Marcello's visit gives us the first glimpses of his gratuitous cruelty. He urges Manganiello to beat up Hemlock, laughs afterward, and torments his mother by then calling out, "Where is your missing chauffeur?" It's an early sign of Marcello's sadism. That is, his pleasure in inflicting pain on or watching the infliction of pain on others. We see both the origins and the manifestations of this pathology as his memories unfold. But the fact that he dispatches a fascist party agent to beat up his mother's lover already links Marcello's sadistic intentions with those of fascism itself. This connection to violence, along with fascism's punishing assault on all forms of sexual difference, enrich Marcello's attraction to the movement as a source of conformist camouflage. Marcello also treats his father sadistically when they arrive at the asylum amid a swirl of autumn leaves. They find the elderly man riding a political tract in a vast marble auditorium wearing an unlaced straitjacket. Have a look.
Modellarsi sull'immagine dello Stato, eccetera, eccetera. Strage e malinconia. Strage e malinconia.
Antonio, tuo figlio ha deciso di sposarsi.
Marcello si sposa. Strage e malinconia.
Guarda, la partecipazione di nozze.
Smettila, Marcello, è tuo padre.
Mi piace, metti la firma. Leggi, è meno pazzo di quello che sembra. Potrei restare un momento solo con mio padre? Quando ero piccolo, mi raccontavi le tue spedizioni punitive.
Ma non so, non ricordo niente.
Perché te ne vergogni? È importante per me. Quando eri sano, tu usavi il manganello.
Sì,
E davi l'olio di ricino.
sì,
E non hai torturato?
sì.
Non hai ucciso? Hai anche ucciso.
Vattene! Franz! Franz!
The pale vastness of the asylum's interior resembles the party's headquarters. Marcello made his proposal. Through this architectural similarity, through this connection, Bertolucci links the madness of the mental institution with the derangement of the fascist state itself. Marcello's father is writing these words when we first see him. Quote, "The state must model itself on the idea of the individual." Well, that is, of course, the antithesis of fascist ideology, which demands compulsory and collective conformity to a set of values, a single set of values and conduct. And what his father proposes, of course, in stressing individualism is the obverse of Marcello's desire to negate his individuality through fascist affiliation. Needing his father's signature on a legal document for his marriage, Marcello moves the old man's hand across the page and then torments him with questions about what he sarcastically calls your punitive forays. Didn't you use a big cudgel to torture men, he asks. Didn't you administer castor oil? Didn't you kill? Marcello's father is haunted by the revival of these memories of some unspecified violent political involvement. And he answers yes, but then he flees and strikes out at his abusive son with his loose straitjacket sleeve, and then voluntarily presents himself to be tied up in the straitjacket. That gesture suggests that the old man requires the pain of physical imprisonment both as a payment for the pain he inflicted on others, but also as a distraction from the guilty memories that Marcello has forced him to recall. Marcello hates his father, and he wants to associate himself from him, and yet, ironically, in this scene, he reveals their unmistakable similarity as he tortures his father into confessing that he tortured others, inflicts pain on him in getting him to describe how he inflicted pain on others in the past. But there's one difference. Unlike his father, Marcello isn't acting under orders here. His cruelty is entirely self-directed, entirely personal and sadistic, and one might say there's a second difference as well because it carries no sense of guilt for Marcello the way his father is burdened by guilt for his past actions. However, other things in Marcello's past do produce guilt and trauma. Above all, his childhood sexual encounter with the family chauffeur Lino. It's a defining moment in Marcello's life and what Bertolucci called one of the two primal scenes in the film. Well, Freud identifies the primal scene as the moment when a male child voyeuristically witnesses his parents having sex. But more broadly, the term primal scene refers to any traumatic sexual disclosure or experience in childhood. These experiences are usually repressed later, but they can erupt in adulthood as memories under the force of certain triggers. And indeed, this eruption of memories that have been repressed fascinates Bertolucci. Well, Marcello's memory of Lino arises now partly through its association with the guilt he feels as he rides in the car as they follow the professor and Anna. Now that he knows Quadri is to be executed, Marcello feels guilty about that, but even more so about the potential death of the woman he has come to love. He wants to catch up with their car, he tells Manganiello, in order to save Anna, to keep her from being killed along with her husband. When Manganiello tells him he can't save her because we can't afford witnesses, Marcello is so appalled that he wants to wash his hands of his guilty involvement in this planned killing. And in fact, he tries to get out of the car and refuse to participate. This is not, after all, what he had proposed to the fascist minister when he went there. Well, Manganiello drives alongside Marcello as he walks down the road, and the sight of the slow-moving car is the specific trigger for the recollection of the time he hailed the family limousine as it drove behind him. Marcello was 13 then, and he had just been beaten up by a band of mocking schoolboys. Adults watched with amusement that beating as he was assaulted for being different, in this case, primarily for being rich. Marcello's short pants and long hair were marks of his class privilege, of his effeminacy, though, also in the eyes of these boys. And there's a cruel suggestion as they descend upon him that they are unbuckling Marcello's pants in order to prove that he's really a male. Well, this violent assault and its aftermath are the originary sources of Marcello's association with his association of sex with humiliating exposure and pain. And the experience contributes, then, to his compensatory need as an adult for the safety of conformity and the complete eschew of difference. Have a look.
Come ti chiami?
Marcello Clerici, lei?
Pasqualino Semirano. Ma chiama Molino.
Da quanto tempo non ti confessi?
Da quando ho fatto la prima comunione.
Male, figlio, molto male. Quanti anni hai?
34.
Ed hai vissuto tutto questo tempo come una bestia. Dimmi, quali peccati hai commesso?
Li ho commessi tutti, anche i più gravi.
Tutti?
Tutti. Ho anche ucciso.
Hai ucciso? E non hai sentito il bisogno di confessarti?
Come?
Non hai sentito il bisogno di correre a confessarti?
Avevo 13 anni. Ma che te stavano facendo i compagni tuoi?
Sono degli stupidi.
Ma che volevi, Nati?
Niente.
Ah, sì? Che regalo?
Un revolver.
A fulminante.
No, uno vero.
Ne tengo uno pure io. E una mouse. Ah, vu? Si ha votato.
E dov'è?
Sta in camera mia. Vieni. Tengo pure un bel kimono orientale. Ah, sai chi è Madame Butterfly?
Dove andiamo?
Avanti, racconta. Che cosa voleva da te?
Non lo capivo. Era proprio come una donna.
Una donna?
Lo sentivo tremare.
Insomma, che c'è stato? Dei baci, dei toccamenti. Ma sei sicuro che stai dicendo la verità?
Sì.
E c'è stato tra di voi un rapporto carnale?
Spara, caspita. E spara, ammazza la bella butterfly.
Raccontami i particolari.
Basta, vi prego. Sembra quasi che un peccato di sodomia per la Chiesa sia più grave dell'uccisione di un uomo.
Come ti permetti, insolente? Ricordati che io sono il prete e tu sei un peccatore. E dopo quella volta hai avuto altri rapporti con uomini.
No. Vita sessuale normale.
Vale a dire,
Il bordello verso i 18 anni. E poi soltanto rapporti con donne.
e questa secondo te è una vita sessuale normale?
Sì. Perché?
Ma tu, figliuolo, hai vissuto sempre nel peccato. Normale vuol dire matrimonio, avere una moglie, una famiglia.
È quello che voglio.
Bravo, bravo, bravo.
Sto per costruirmi una vita normale.
The adolescent beating and the homosexual encounter that follows it have both long been repressed in Marcello's mind, it seems. But as he rides in the car, he isn't recalling them for the first time. Rather, he is recalling the recent experience of recalling them when he went to confession and spoke to the priest in that obligatory sacramental rite necessary to marry in the Catholic Church. His memory of the confession, then, and his memory of the event itself are intercut, so that the more distant adolescent memory is folded within the more recent one of the confessional. At times they overlap, as when we hear the voice of the inquisitive priest asking for carnal details while we see Marcello kissing the chauffeur. Lino seduces Marcello, not by rescuing him from the boys so much, but by promising to show him the gun that he keeps in his room. As Marcello relives this traumatic encounter, Bertolucci emphasizes the strangeness that Marcello felt then by disconnecting sound and image. As they race through the house, we hear Lino's voice promising to give Marcello his gun, but we don't see Lino speaking or view him steadily until he pushes Marcello violently into his bedroom. We anticipate a rape, especially as Lino begins to undress, while Marcello buries his face. But what occurs is more complicated. After flourishing the pistol, Lino withholds it from Marcello's grasping hand and puts it on the bed between them as an erotic fetish. Lino also places it between his legs, both to heighten his own desire and as a lure for Marcello. But, note, the boy, he's told, can only have the gun if he surrenders sexually. But at this point, to Lino's surprise, Marcello becomes the active party in the seduction. When the chauffeur removes his cap and lets down his hair, Marcello strokes that hair. And then, just as he had chased Lino on the lawn, he now initiates the sexual contact by kissing the chauffeur passionately. Well, when the prurient priest presses Marcello for details about this carnal moment, about this sexual encounter, Marcello tells him that he was attracted to Lino because Lino looked like a woman with his long hair. Now, this is a lie. Although Lino likes to dress as a woman and has a kimono like Madame Butterfly's, he has, after all, loaded a phallic gun and positioned it near his penis. Marcello's attraction, then, is not to the illusion of Lino as a female, but rather to Lino as a homosexual male who enjoys cross-dressing. Remember that Marcello also lied to Italo earlier when he said that he was attracted to Giulia because of her body. So even when he's confessing in these two scenes, Marcello is still desperate to withhold certain things so as to be able to present himself, not truly, but to present himself as a heterosexual. Given this need, we may wonder if Marcello's memories of being with Lino at this moment are entirely reliable, or if they have been edited not just in the telling of them to the priest, but also edited within Marcello's consciousness because of their disturbing homoerotic content. We may suspect this kind of psychic editing, even in the act of remembering and confessing, when we cut abruptly in the scene from the recollection of kissing Lino on the bed back to the confessional and then to the image of Lino kissing Marcello's knee. What exactly happened in between here? The cut occurs when the priest asks, "What happened? Carnal relations?" he asks. Well, it seems there is some part of the sexual experience that Marcello isn't telling the priest or even allowing himself to remember fully, even though he knows it occurred. What could that be? Well, it's probably the sexual pleasure Marcello experienced in the encounter, which frightened him as an adolescent and frightens him as an adult. We can't be sure, but the extremity of Marcello's response to Lino suggests that he has omitted from his confession something important, repressed in his memory an inadmissible truth of sexual intimacy that we don't see. He jumps up suddenly and begins firing the gun all around the room, with one shot hitting Lino, the source of his forbidden pleasure. Well, Lino is aroused by this gunplay at first, as if it's a kind of sadomasochistic game. "Shoot the pretty Madame Butterfly," he shouts. Well, although Marcello has the wherewithal afterward to place the gun in Lino's hand to suggest suicide, the firing rampage itself is completely out of control, and it seems then less a deliberate desire to kill his seducer than it is a moment of homosexual panic on the part of one whose own erotic pleasure and desire as a gay male has been unmistakably disclosed. It's a manic response directed against the entire forbidden erotic experience, an attempt to disavow his homosexual arousal as a boy, just as he tries to disavow it, as we've seen, as an adult. Marcello needs to do this. Same-sex desire is another mark of difference for a lonely, neglected adolescent who is already isolated by his wealth. And homosexual desire also, of course, carries with it a burden of guilt for Marcello. As a boy, he tried to deny both that guilt and to punish Lino for producing his unwanted desire by shooting around the room and finally shooting and hitting him. But in doing so, I think, Marcello, of course, inevitably takes on the larger guilt for what he thinks is a murder in his attempt in somehow to wipe out the guilt he feels for sexually being aroused by this man. Thus, he confesses to the priest this killing, and he seems surprised, Marcello does, and a bit discontented that the priest is more preoccupied with the probable sin of sodomy here, prurring it as the priest is, than with the confessed sin of what he believed to be a murder. We later learn that Marcello's confession of murder was actually unnecessary. The bullet that hit Lino didn't kill him, who is, at the end of the film, once again the object of Marcello's homophobic rage when he sees him in the Colosseum. Well, after this primal scene, Marcello dislikes being touched, the word that priest uses, so with such relish, touch. Around other people, Marcello holds his body rigid, often keeping his arms near his side. Although he is a non-believer, he feels gratified by the mandatory confession and his selective unburdening nonetheless. He assures the priest that his adult relationships have only been with women, and when the old cleric condemns homosexuality, Marcello is pleased because that reinforces just what Marcello himself believes and what Marcello wants to hear. The priest tells Marcello to pursue normality, which means, quote, matrimony, having a wife, a family. However, the confession ends with more enigmatic disclosures. Have a look.
Mediocre, piena di idee meschine, di piccole ambizioni meschine. Sì, tutta letto e cucina.
Non devi usare queste espressioni.
La normalità. Voglio costruire la mia normalità. Faticosamente.
Ma nella religione...
Fuori dalla religione. Dio è così buono. La Vergine è così materna. Cristo è così misericordioso. E il prete è pieno di comprensione. Non avete provato alcun orrore per il mio crimine. Solamente un po' di stupore perché non sono venuto subito a confessarmi.
Devi pentirti, figliuolo, devi implorare il perdono.
Mi sono già pentito. Voglio che il perdono me lo dia la società. Sì. Mi confesso oggi per la colpa che commetterò domani. È il sangue che lava il sangue. Il prezzo che mi chiede la società. Io lo pagherò.
Fai parte di qualche setta, di qualche gruppo sovversivo.
No. No. Faccio parte dell'organismo che dà la caccia ai sovversivi.
Ego te absolvo a peccatis tuis.
As Marcello recalls his confession, he inserts an hallucination of Julia in her wedding dress. It was probably only a mental image at the time of his confession, but when he recalls the confession now, that memory image takes the form of an actual vision because that image of Julia distills his feelings for his wife so powerfully. He finds her delectably mediocre, the ideal embodiment of the half-baked ideas, petty ambitions, and conventions of her bourgeois class. She is, quote, all bed and kitchen, everything Marcello both wants and despises in a wife. Well, Marcello is glad to receive the priest's absolution, but more important, he says he wants to clear his conscience by paying his debt to society. That is, he wants to atone to society for being different, but without letting society know he is different. Joining the fascists in their assault on sexual aberrations is one way Marcello feels he can do this. For Marcello, then, joining the fascists means not just protective conformity, but also it means a kind of moral exoneration for the perversity of his past, for the perversity of feeling homoerotic desires and knowing he feels them even though he refuses consciously to entertain them, even in moments of confession. Yet, Marcello foresees something. He foresees that his membership with the fascists is going to cause him to commit other sins, even as he feels it's atoning for the sins of his homoerotic adolescence. Indeed, Marcello is already planning at this point to betray Quadri under the guise of friendship. This is what he refers to when he says, "the sin I'll commit tomorrow." But that sin, Marcello says, absolves those other sins that he feels he has committed against society in the past by his difference, by his aristocratic past, his higher education, his homosexual experience. Thus, Marcello assures the priest that he now belongs to a group that hunts down subversives, that he is an agent, therefore, of moral rectitude. This need for spurious ethical reasoning indicates that Marcello knows the crimes he's about to commit will cause him guilt, and so he's already formulating a psychological strategy for neutralizing it. One crime wipes out another. What I'm doing is right. Well, before leaving Marcello's memory of Lino, I want to suggest that this primal scene of adolescent sexual arousal, violence, and guilt has two clear effects on his psychosexual behavior as an adult. First, even before the repressed memory becomes conscious, the experience with Lino shapes Marcello's disgust for the sexual body, for nakedness, and fills him with a compulsion to punish carnality, as he does with his mother. Second, for Marcello, after this, violence becomes not just a punishing response to sexuality, but also paradoxically, violence becomes one of the two sources of sexual arousal for him, either injuring another person or spying on erotic scenes. Those are the two ways in which he finds sexual stimulation. Now, Marcello fears being seen by others, but as I've noted, and as we've seen, he enjoys the visual power of the voyeur. As Laura Mulvey notes, there's something inherently sadistic about voyeurism itself. Put simply, the experience with Lino, then, is the fountainhead of Marcello's sadism. Remember, in this respect, the gun in the scene with Lino is not just a weapon that Marcello fires, but it's also a kind of violent sex toy, a token of punishing sexual power. We'll see another manifestation of Marcello's erotic sadism in the train with his new wife shortly, but leading up to this honeymoon trip is a pre-wedding party for Marcello held at the residence of his blind friend, Italo. The sightless piano player is a reminder of the moral blindness of the supporters of fascism, which include, of course, Italo and Marcello himself. We also see in this party blind men fighting other blind men over politics, for Bertolucci an apt symbol of Italy itself in the 1930s. The entire spectacle of the disabled makes Marcello nervous, and again he tells Italo that he wants to be just, quote, a normal man. Italo responds now, however, rather cynically by defining a truly normal man as one whose head would turn at the sight of a beautiful woman and who is glad to see others, quote, just like he is. Quote, that's why normal men like crowded beaches, Italo explains. Well, by this definition, Marcello isn't normal, and Italo knows this. Marcello is abnormal. He isn't attracted to most women, and he gravitates to people who are unlike himself, which is to say, he's drawn to those people who are normal and who naturally conform to the prevailing tastes and values of their country and class. But that's camouflage. He's merely attempting to pass as normal. So it's distressing when Italo then reminds Marcello that, quote, a normal man, a genuinely normal man, quote, is what Mussolini calls a true fascist. Marcello, by this definition, will never be a true fascist, no matter how he tries to prove himself. And both he and Italo know this. Italo, after all, knows that Marcello is no more normal than he is. Italo has found protection within the fascist regime, but he doesn't for a minute imagine that as a blind man he is different. He refers, therefore, to himself and to Marcello as being, quote, different from the others and two of a kind. And when he says this, a look of horror and anxiety crosses Marcello's face, which we see in close-up. It's a fear that others will definitely see his deviance, if even a blind man can tell that he is different. We cut from this scene to the honeymoon trip to Paris. Along the way, Julia makes her own confession. She tells Marcello, "I'm unworthy of you because I'm not a virgin." She goes on to explain that for 6 years she was the mistress of a 60-year-old man, a family friend, who violated her when she was 15. Marcello says that he didn't marry her because she was a virgin, so it really doesn't matter to him, and he is far too preoccupied with other things at this time to care. He knows that he must get off the train at Ventimiglia for new instructions about his assignment in Paris. Now, we'll examine that meeting with Raoul in a moment, but afterward, when Marcello reboards the train, he asks Julia to describe how her older lover first diverginated her, and she recounts what was clearly a rape, and this, and only this description, arouses Marcello sufficiently to finally have sex with his new wife. Have a look.
E lui entrò pianissimo. Venne dietro di me e mi chiese: "Che fai?"
Vieni a sederti qui.
Il tema d'italiano, dissi. E lui mi prese per i capelli. Ma io, pensa che lo chiamavo zio. E mi ha sbotonato la camicetta. Ero molto sviluppata a 15 anni. E lui è stretto, mi ha preso e è stretto da farmi svenire. Poi, non so, ero distesa sul letto. E lui mi stava sopra. Allora ho capito tutto. E mi è andata via la forza.
Ma ti piaceva?
Ero passiva.
E poi?
Mi ha fatto tutto quello che ha voluto. Ma come ho pianto. E lui, per consolarmi, mi disse che era pazzo, completamente pazzo di me.
6 anni, eh?
Listening carefully to Julia's description of how her assailant overpowered her, how she lay passive and powerless as he entered her, Marcello reenacts the rape. He's sexually aroused by his vicarious identification with the rapist. He undresses Julia, as the older man had, pins her arms behind her, and presses her down under him. Without this fantasy of brutal force, the thought of sex with Julia is repugnant. Only sadism, only the idea he's raping her, arouses him. Now, Julia has no understanding of this. She's just happy that her husband at last has responded to her physically. But Bertolucci daringly juxtaposes Marcello's rape fantasy with a conventional romantic score, and the couple disappears at the bottom of the frame in a kind of Hollywood cliché for sex. But these clichés, ironically, only serve to underscore the decidedly unconventional nature of Marcello's gratification here. The scene ends with an extended shot of changing images seen through the train window. The landscape outside is reflected in these windows. This is unmistakably a self-reflexive gesture. The train window here resembles a reel of film as it passes through a projector, reminding us that we are watching a film. But this is also Bertolucci's tongue-in-cheek reminder that as we watch his film, he has parodied in this scene mainstream movie conventions in the music and staging of that scene. Now, the short scene in Ventimiglia that precedes this one is the most bizarre in the film. Here it is.
Sono pazza, completamente pazza. Sono pazza.
Clerici! Ma che fa? Perdiamo tempo. Venga.
In che senso?
Ma sì, l'attività del professor Quadri in Francia è diventata invadente e provocatoria. Si impone una punizione esemplare. Voi avreste dovuto entrare in contatto con lui, ispirargli fiducia, raccogliere informazioni. Invece?
Invece?
C'è un contrordine da Roma, dovete solo eliminarlo. Chiaro?
Bene.
L'operazione non avverrà a Parigi, a voi la scelta del luogo e del momento. A voi. Non abbiamo altro da dirci.
Bene. Questo vuol dire che non ho alternative.
Camerata Clerici. L'azione dovrà essere pronta e decisa. Camerata! Il treno per Parigi parte tra un'ora.
E il cappello? Ho perduto il cappello. Dov'è?
This is Bertolucci's most striking foray into surrealism, a cinematic style we'll explore fully next class with Buñuel. Everything we see features incongruous juxtapositions. There's an illogic that defies our rational understanding of reality in this scene and evokes the anarchic realm of dreams. Raoul's headquarters are a brothel, but the brothel itself resembles a museum with monumental imitations of Renaissance artworks. Manganiello tries to urge a prostitute to arouse Marcello by telling him that she's crazy. Now, given Marcello's response to his deranged father and his fear of his own incipient madness and his misogyny, we would expect him to react to this attempt to arouse him by claiming she's insane with absolute aversion. But instead, he embraces the woman compassionately, as if he identifies with the role she has been asked to play. Perhaps Marcello recognizes that he too is performing a role for the fascist. But he also embraces the woman because the prostitute looks like that glamorous prostitute he'd seen before at the ministry when he looked behind the curtains at those fascist headquarters. Even though that woman's gaze exposed his position, revealed his voyeurism, that scene left a deep impression on the normally sex-averse Marcello because it presented a tableau of sex and power. In that case, political power entwined with sex, as the woman lay before the minister on the desk. Now, Raoul informs Marcello that plans have changed. Quadri must be eliminated. As he transmits this very serious news, we see that the official's desk is covered with walnuts, and indeed he's eating one. Within this absurdist realm, Marcello treats the gun that he receives like a toy. He points it at Raoul, at himself, and then around the room as if it were all a game. By staging this surreal farce in a fascist administrative center, Bertolucci again presents the movement itself as a plunge into derangement. When Marcello and Julia arrive in their Paris hotel, he jokingly refers to Quadri as a hunchback, that is, as one who does not conform, as one who is different. Well, it's true. 9 years earlier, the fascists arrested Quadri on suspicion that he was working against the movement in Italy, and they tortured him. Prior to that, he was a distinguished philosophy professor at the University of Rome, and Marcello was a graduate student working with him and planning to write his thesis under Quadri's direction. Marcello calls to arrange a meeting with Quadri, and unable to fabricate a plausible pretext, he says that he's a former student who would like to reconnect. Quadri pretends not to know who he is, but agrees to see him and invites him to his apartment for coffee. Marcello is troubled, guilt-ridden by the new assignment that he must participate in Quadri's murder. This, after all, was not part of the information-gathering plan he had proposed to the minister in Rome. He tries ineffectually to evade the burden of this role by telling Julia to tell Manganiello that he's out when the man comes calling, and he ignores Manganiello as Manganiello is following him down Paris streets. When Marcello and Julia arrive at Quadri's apartment, they're greeted by the professor's young wife, Anna, along with his entourage of young men, intellectual admirers and political sympathizers who serve and protect the professor. When Marcello is admitted, it's clear that Quadri remembers him very well. He recalls that Marcello had planned to write his thesis under him on the allegory of the cave from Plato's Republic. In fact, Marcello quotes admiringly from one of Quadri's lectures 9 years ago, in which he discussed the cave allegory in a scene that is rich with implication. Have a look.
Curioso, Clerici. Lei viene fin qui per vedermi. Ricorda, professore, appena lei entrava in aula, dovevamo chiudere i finestroni. Lei non sopportava tutta quella luce, quel rumore. L'ho capito dopo perché faceva così. In tutti questi anni, vuol sapere la cosa che mi è rimasta più impressa nella memoria? La sua voce. Immagina un grande sotterraneo a forma di caverna. All'interno, degli uomini che vi abitano fin dall'infanzia, tutti incatenati e obbligati a guardare il fondo della caverna. Alle loro spalle, lontano, brilla la luce di un fuoco. Tra il fuoco e i prigionieri, immagina un muro, basso, simile a quella piccola ribalta sulla quale il burattinaio fa apparire i suoi burattini. Era il novembre del 28. Ricordo. E ora cerca di immaginare degli uomini che passano dietro quel muretto, portando delle statue di legno e di pietra. Le statue sono più alte di quel muro.
Non poteva portarmi da Roma un regalo migliore di questi ricordi, Clerici.
I prigionieri incatenati di Platone. E come ci somigliano.
Che cosa vedono?
Che cosa vedono?
Lei che viene dall'Italia dovrebbe saperlo per esperienza.
Vedono solo le ombre che il fuoco proietta sul fondo della caverna che è davanti a loro.
Ombre, i riflessi delle cose, come accade a voi altri oggi in Italia.
Se quei prigionieri fossero liberi di parlare, non chiamerebbero forse realtà quelle loro visioni?
Sì, bravo. Scambierebbero per realtà le ombre della realtà. Il mito della caverna.
Era questa la tesi di laurea che lei venne a propormi.
L'ha finita poi?
No, partito lei ne ho fatto un'altra.
Mi dispiace davvero, Clerici. Io avevo molta fiducia in lei.
In the Republic, Plato describes a cave in which men sit together facing a wall upon which shadows are projected from behind them. There is a fire there, and wooden figurines are passed in front of the flames to create the projected shadows of men and animals. Plato's point is that this realm of shadows is what the spectators take to be reality because they have never seen the light of the sun outside. Similarly, for Plato, humankind lives in the delusive belief that what our eyes behold in the world is reality when actually there is a higher, truer reality that he calls the realm of forms. The purpose of life for Plato is to seek enlightenment, to know that higher, truer reality. If the cavemen ever saw the world in the sunlight, they would never again mistake the shadows for reality. By the same token, if we ever behold the realm of forms, we'll realize that what we see on earth is mere delusion. Now, the lecture left a deep impression on Marcello, who, as he recounts it, imitates the shadows Plato describes on the wall behind him while speaking. While Plato invests the cave allegory with metaphysical significance, Quadri also interpreted it politically in his lecture. He saw it as a version of Italy under the rising tyranny of fascism. Quadri stressed that the spectators in the cave were victims of fascism, shackled together as a collective and deceived by Mussolini's rhetoric of Italian grandeur, imprisoned by fascism's rigid nationalistic codes. He refers to the fascist leaders as puppeteers who use lies to manipulate public response. Like the projectors of shadows in Plato's cave, the architects of fascism created a false reality, Quadri says, by fabricating a cultural history that traced the modern fascist movement back to the glory of imperial ancient Rome. Make Italy great again. Sound familiar? In a rare moment of insight, Marcello himself compares Italians to Plato's deluded prisoners. His attraction to fascism, after all, is not ideological. He is not in any way committed to it as something that has deluded him. Quadri readily agrees, reiterating that Italians have indeed confused the shadows cast by fascist leaders for true reality. But Marcello then challenges that certainty with a question. He says, if Italians were free to speak, might they not affirm that what Quadri calls fascist shadows are really reality and not just visions? Well, Marcello poses this epistemological possibility that Italians want to believe in these shadows and are not simply being forced to, because while he respects Quadri, he does not see Quadri himself as an enlightener of men, but rather as a creator of shadows himself, and as one who may be misreading the Italian populace. He recalls of Quadri, quote, as soon as you entered the classroom, they used to close the windows. You couldn't stand the sunlight and the racket. Throughout the scene, Bertolucci plays with light and shadow to convert Quadri's study into a version of Plato's cave. At times, this shadow play reflects Marcello's view of the former professor as a source of intellectual falsification. For example, from Marcello's perspective, we see Quadri's face in close-up, half hidden by shadow. Later, as they continue to discuss the cave myth, we see Quadri silhouetted against a lighted window, appearing to Marcello as a shadow. Now, Quadri is certainly in the dark about the fact that he's going to be assassinated. But the sunlight behind Quadri out that window is real, and Quadri is closer to that sunlight, closer to the source of light and presumable truth than Marcello is. Marcello's shadow, rather, we see only silhouetted against the back wall of the room, far, far from the window and the light. Quadri is flattered by what he calls Marcello's gift of memory. It is a gift that Marcello has brought him. But Quadri is disappointed that Marcello changed his thesis topic after he left Rome. Quote, chose a different theme. Now that's a loaded phrase, and it refers, of course, to Marcello's embrace not just of a different thesis topic, but to his embrace of fascism, which Marcello at this point makes no attempt to disguise. This admission, this political admission, disappoints Quadri still more than the change in thesis topic. And the conversation ends in a medium two-shot in which both men are covered in shadows. But beyond the political and epistemological implications of this scene, it is also a unmistakably self-reflexive one, another self-reflexive one. Now, film theorists like Jean-Luc Baudret, who we'll be reading in coming classes, have likened the experience of watching a film to the experience Plato describes his cave dwellers going through. The images we see projected on the film screen seem real to us, but directors like Antonioni in Blow Up and Bertolucci in The Conformist shatter this mimetic illusion which Hollywood was so eager to cultivate, and they shatter it by reminding us of what Baudret calls the apparatus that is producing what we see. The cinema camera, if you will, the projector, the equivalent of the fire before which the figures in Plato's cave model are passed to produce the shadow illusion. Now, I'm going to be talking about Baudry's theory in the next few classes, but for now, let's consider the sexual tension that suddenly develops among Marcello, Julia, and Anna. It starts when Anna greets them at the door with her barking dog. Marcello gazes at her with an interest that he hasn't shown in any woman except the prostitute, and we wonder why. Well, the source of his attraction is complicated, but I think we get the clearest sense of its origins when Anna walks down the hallway in the apartment wearing trousers with a cigarette dangling from her lips, and Marcello sees this. Have a look.
Ora comprarla una stampatrice, almeno in 3 o 4 mesi ammortizza la spesa.
Si ripara dopo, c'è gente. Deciderà il professore.
Monsieur Clerici, mio marito si scusa, è ancora occupato ma la riceve fra pochi minuti. Ça va?
Prego, non ho fretta.
Ha detto che si può cenare insieme stasera.
Volentieri.
E poi si va a ballare a Joinville. D'accordo?
Ah, io per ballare ci sto sempre.
È ancora permesso ballare in Italia?
Ah, ora che ci penso, non è possibile.
Perché?
Non ho niente da mettermi.
Sai cosa facciamo? Ti accompagno al Faubourg a comprare un abito.
Ah sì, andiamo subito?
Subito no, non posso. Ho una lezione a scuola alle 3:30. Ma posso passare all'hotel se vuoi alle 5. A che hotel êtes-vous?
All'hotel Toulouse. L'aspettiamo alle 5.
No, ce sont des choses pour les femmes. L'uomo deve pagare.
Davvero mi lasci andare, non ti dispiace?
No.
Accompagnalo dal professore.
Venga, venga, Clerici. Ve l'hanno dato il caffè?
Sì, grazie, professore. Grazie, professore. Arrivederci.
Arrivederci.
Giulia, sì, sono curiosa. Prima di sposarlo, ci andavi già a letto?
Sono proprio curioso.
Bertolucci presents Anna here in a tracking shot as she surveys the group of men and one woman framed in the arch of the entryway. Marcello looks up and sees her leaning against the wall. What is it that attracts him so much that he confronts her shortly after this in her bedroom, expresses sexual desire, and looks at a tag in her ballet shoes so that he can follow her to the address where she teaches the classes? Several things. First, as he tells Anna, she looks like the prostitute he saw at Ventimiglia, who in turn resembled the one he spied with the fascist minister in that scene that illustrated a man's power and control over a woman arrayed on his desk. So when Marcello later confronts Anna in her bedroom and tells her of this resemblance, as he does so, he grabs her hair against her protest and pulls her violently down onto the bed in a show of sadistic power, while Julia is waiting for him in the next room. There could also be, in this attraction, an Oedipal component at work. The beautiful Anna is the wife of Marcello's former mentor, a kind of father figure with whom he is now engaged in a deadly rivalry. Thus, his rebellion against Quadri heightens the desirability of his wife, whom Marcello later plays footsie with under the table where Quadri is sitting. But Marcello is, after all, dominantly homosexual, and Anna arouses his same-sex desire through her cultivated androgyny. She slouches like a man, wears trousers, smokes a cigarette insouciantly, and exhibits the open gaze of a man as she surveys the group around the coffee table. The masculine element in Anna rouses Marcello's homosexual desire, and this becomes clear when he spies Anna later attempting to seduce Julia in their hotel room. Anna asks Julia in this scene if Marcello had sex with her before marriage, because Anna doesn't seem to be very convinced that he is in fact a heterosexual, and she's quite right. From the start, Anna's own attention is only on Julia, not on Marcello, to whom she is rude and whom she mistrusts. Anna wants to show Julia Paris, she says, to have dinner with her, to take her dancing and shopping, an activity, she tells Marcello, for wives only. She wants to be alone with her. Anna even enlists Julia's help in making anti-fascist flyers. Well, moved by lesbian desire, Anna wants to be alone with Julia, while Marcello wants to be alone with Anna. Anna's willing to tolerate Marcello's advances in order to stay close to his wife. But she has another motive for submitting to him as well, as we'll see when Marcello comes to see her at the dance studio. Have a look.
Che?
Continui.
Perché mi fai leggere questa lettera?
Te lo dirò dopo.
E poi ci sono le finte esecuzioni. Mi hanno mandato il prete già 3 volte e io ho rifiutato l'estrema unzione. Mi hanno ridato ancora l'olio di ricino, eppure dovrebbero aver capito che dopo quasi 20 anni mi ci sono abituato, non mi fa più niente. Perché devo leggere questa lettera?
Vuoi proprio che te lo dica? Perché sei un fascista, una spia. Lo sai come vi chiamano qui? Des mouchards.
Tuo marito lo sa?
Perché pensi che ti ha ricevuto? Sei un verme. Mi fai schifo, mi fai schifo.
Vado a prendere Giulia all'hotel. Ripartiamo col primo treno per Roma.
Non lo faresti mai, sei troppo vigliacco. Marcello, abbracciami. Marcello, ho paura. Marcello, non facci del male. Giuralo. Giuralo, ti prego.
Non lo so.
When Marcello urges Anna to run away with him to Brazil, she forces him to read a letter from a fascist torture victim in Italy and tells him that she knows that he's a fascist spy, something her husband does not. Quote, "You're a worm. You revolt me." But she also understands the power that Marcello wields and the danger that he poses, so she offers herself to him sexually, undressing, in exchange for a promise to spare her and her husband. Quote, "Please don't hurt us." Marcello, in response, offers only a vague, but not insincere, "I don't know." Later, he follows Anna as she shops with Julia and is in turn followed by Manganiello, who realizes now that Marcello is getting cold feet and who bellows for him to come out into the hotel courtyard because they need to have a talk. As Marcello, inside, enters his hotel suite, he hears Anna and his wife, and then spies on them in a brief moment that Bertolucci described this way, quote, "It is a scene of vague homosexual seduction pervaded by an erotic shiver. But beyond the direct narrative meaning, the situation recalls the primal scene. Now I feel my whole cinematic work is contained in this scene." Wow, we better have a look at this.
No. Ma che sciocca che sei. In fondo l'hai riconosciuto tu stessa poco fa. Se non fossi sposata, hai detto.
Sì, l'avrò anche detto. Però sono sposata.
Non vuol dire niente. Bisogna vedere. Sposata con chi?
Piace a me. Ehi! Ehi, oh! Ora mi provi il vestito?
No. Non muoverti. Voglio vestirti io.
Ma sai che sei strana? Vuoi farmi anche da cameriera adesso?
Che te ne importa? Piace a me.
Ti prego, non guardarmi. Mi vergogno.
Che c'è di male? Sono una donna come te.
Sì, ma mi guardi in un modo. Voltati. Marcello lo vedrà. Les violettes, monsieur? Vous voulez des violettes? Ce sont de vraies violettes de Parme.
Elles sont vraiment de Parme.
Vraiment?
Donnez-moi un bouquet.
Merci. Debout les damnés de la terre.
Debout les damnés de la terre, debout les forçats de la faim. La raison
dans son cratère, c'est l'éruption de la fin. Du passé, faisons table rase, où l'esclave debout, debout. Le monde va changer de base, nous ne sommes rien, soit.
Bertolucci calls this the film's second primal scene because it transports Marcello back to his original primal encounter with Lino. Anna is kissing Giulia's legs in the same pose and position in which Lino kissed Marcello's adolescent legs just before Marcello fired the gun. It is a moment, then, of acute pleasure and lasting guilt. Vicariously, though, through Giulia, Marcello is able to relive his homosexual initiation, but to do so safely now, as Anna plays the role of Lino. Anna, in close-up, sees Marcello watching, and like that look-alike prostitute he spied in the minister's office, she lets him watch. Anna understands that voyeurism gives Marcello pleasure, and she seems to be offering this pleasure to him in the scene in exchange for his protection. Giulia, like the adolescent Marcello, is both aroused and confused at the way Anna is kissing her legs and at the way Anna looks at her when she says, "I want to dress you." Giulia shyly reminds Anna that she's a married woman, and in a moment of dramatic irony, she even wonders what Marcello will think of her new dress. When Marcello returns, after glimpsing this, to the street, he buys Parma violets from a young anti-fascist, but the International Socialist anthem that she and others are singing makes him nervous. Will they see that he's not one of them? Will they see that he's a fascist? Well, he gives these politicized violets to Anna as they meet and kiss in an extreme close-up, but she bites him and draws blood, and she does so not from passion, but from anger. Giulia reports that Anna has invited them to join her and Quadri at her family's house in the French mountains. Now, Anna has a twofold motive in this. She wants to stay close to Giulia, but she also wants to keep an eye on Marcello. She is in no way persuaded that he has changed political parties or perspectives because he has brought her a flower associated with the socialist demonstrators. Unlike Quadri, who imagines that Marcello might change his mind about fascism, Anna sees through the political symbolism of those violets, and she fully expects the worst from him. But neither she nor Quadri realize that Marcello's fascist activity is not ideological and definitely not patriotic, but is born of a desperate personal need to fit in. At a Chinese restaurant that evening, Quadri proposes a test of Marcello's friendship. He asks him to deliver a letter in Italy, which proves to be a blank piece of paper. He knows that Marcello would be jailed if he agrees to this, and when Marcello balks at it, Quadri wrongly assumes that Marcello isn't a dedicated fascist, because if he were, he would have readily agreed to deliver the letter and then betrayed both Quadri, the sender, and the letter's recipient. Well, this is a fatal misreading on Quadri's part. All the while this is going on, Manganiello is spying from another table. And when they're alone, Marcello points the gun at Manganiello awkwardly and then tries to give it back, saying, "I don't want to kill anyone." Well, the fascist agent refuses, lecturing him on the importance of overcoming his qualms and not betraying the cause. This brings us to the film's most celebrated scene, in the dance hall. The mise-en-scène here is striking, fantastic. The high-ceilinged, windowed, brightly lit pavilion makes it look like a stage set with dancers in extravagant gowns moving through it. As Anna and the half-drunk Giulia dance provocatively, with Anna taking the dance role of the male, Marcello is uncomfortable, and he uneasily mutters, "They must stop dancing." He can take no sexual pleasure in their behavior now because the women are drawing attention to themselves in a public place as different, that thing that Marcello fears most in his life. But instead of being ostracized, the women recruit other dancers happily in what becomes a growing spiral that winds in and out of the dance hall. Meanwhile, Marcello formulates a plan that he has been forced to devise. He tells Manganiello the killing will occur, quote, tomorrow by car at dawn, knowing that Manganiello will then contact assassins to coordinate a surprise attack somewhere along the road. Let's have a look.
Eh beh, che c'è da guardare? Ça, c'est Paris. Je suis une femme à la page, n'est-ce pas?
Tu es complètement folle.
Dai, su, andiamo! Forza! Tutti! Tutti!
Parte domani all'alba in macchina.
Un momento, anche la moglie?
No, no.
Meglio così. Ci vediamo a Roma. E buon proseguimento.
Symbolically, we might read the dance as a collectivist alternative to fascism, one that permits freedom, vital movement, and expression within a communal setting, but without any rigid orthodoxy of the kind we find in fascism. Well, Marcello alone refuses to dance and is thus isolated. Ironically, the conformist, who so determinedly wants to blend in, stands alone here, arms tight at his side, because he hates being touched and will not join arms with the dancers. Now, this morbid fear of being touched is a mark of his essential difference, as we have seen, and it is that essential difference that has prompted the need to conform. But the fact is that as we see him here, the difference will always remain. The brilliant aerial shot Bertolucci uses here exposes Marcello's aloneness in that room. But he's also rendered not just alone, but also immobile and powerless when the dancers come in and he is surrounded by this human coil and cannot move. It's an apt image because Marcello's fascist commitment has paralyzed him at this moment, forcing him to contribute to a murder that appalls him, but which he cannot escape. Later, dancing with Anna, Marcello asks her not to drive with Quadri to the countryside the next day, but rather to stay in Paris with him. She lies and says she'll do that, hoping that by doing so she'll keep Marcello from following them when they leave by car at dawn. Now, at this point, Marcello's recollections have caught up with the diegetic present, just as he and Manganiello were about to catch up in the car with Quadri and Anna. As they drive, Marcello reports a dream in which Quadri cured him of blindness in a Swiss clinic, thereby allowing Marcello to run off with a loving Anna. Now, in classic Freudian theory, the dream is unmistakably Marcello's attempted wish fulfillment, in a double sense. To be made to see reality truly, like Plato's cave dwellers freed from the cave and looking at the sunlight, but at the same time getting to possess the woman he desires, freed of all of the shadows of fascism, and at the same time seemingly doing it with the approval of Quadri. But it is only, of course, a fantasy. Fantasies in these dreams are always an attempt to fulfill wishes that are blocked and impossible in our waking experience. Now, this brings us to the bloody climax of The Conformist, the execution that Marcello has reluctantly arranged. Although he is one of the architects of the murders of Quadri and Anna, and although he is morally responsible, Marcello refuses to participate in the actual killing itself. When a stage car accident blocks the road, he witnesses the execution of his former professor and the only woman he ever desired from the safety of the car. The assassinations go on for 10 minutes, and within Bertolucci's expressionistic color scheme, the snow makes the bloodshed in the forest, first suggested by the opening image of that red light, all the more vivid. After an eerie silence, Quadri goes to investigate the road blockage. Fascist agents emerge from the trees and stab him again and again. In close-ups, we see Marcella and Anna in their separate cars, watching. He looks on coldly while she shudders in horror. Have a look.
L'ho sempre detto io, fatemi lavorare nella merda, ma non con un vigliacco. Già per me, vigliacchi, invertiti, ebrei, sono tutti una razza. Forse per me li metterei al muro tutti insieme. Anzi, bisognerebbe eliminarli subito, appena nati.
Nearly as shocking as the killing is Marcello's impassive expression when Anna pounds on the car window, having run from her own car. We see this scene partly from Marcello's point of view, from inside, behind the window, registering Anna's look of rage and betrayal and disbelief, and hearing her muffled screams. Marcello's fear of resisting the fascist movement has paralyzed him here, literally. He conforms, and he will repress the guilt he feels now, as he has repressed his homosexual guilt, until he can project his self-loathing onto another person, as he did when he shot wildly in Lino's bedroom. And he'll find an opportunity to do this, as we'll see. The tracking shot in the forest as the gunmen chase Anna is done with a handheld camera. This unsteadiness matches the jarring violence unfolding as we watch her shot in the back, stagger and collapse, rise and collapse again. Standing outside the car, Manganiello provides a depraved fascist benediction on the slaughter, as well as a judgment of Marcello, whose passivity here disgusts him. Manganiello says, "Kill all the homosexuals, Jews, and cowards." Well, that group would include Marcello, the coward sitting in the car, the closeted homosexual in the back seat, who has refused to pursue Anna with his gun. We move ahead 5 years now, to 1943, as the war is raging. A radio broadcast announces that Mussolini has been forced to resign, and with it, the fall of the fascist government. We see Romans of all classes and ages listening to this broadcast, including Marcello and Giulia. They sit at opposite ends of a dark room, suggesting the estranged state of their marriage, but they have a daughter, and Marcello loves her and wants to protect her, perhaps because his own childhood was so miserably wretched. He leads her in praying the Hail Mary against a sky blue wall. He's still conforming to conventions here, but that phrase, "pray for us sinners," resonates in another way. Marcello has sinned as a fascist, and it's now sinful to be a fascist, and also dangerous. Even the clueless Giulia understands this, and she wants him to, quote, take care as he leaves to meet Italo, his friend, for the first time in many years. As Giulia and Marcello stand separated by a partition, she reveals that she knew years before that he was involved in Quadri's murder, but she excuses that involvement as, quote, an important step in your career. This comes in a two-shot, as the acknowledgement and this spurious exoneration of Marcello's crime ironically bring the alienated couple together. As he's leaving, Marcello tells Giulia, "I want to see how a dictatorship falls." Note, characteristically here, he identifies himself as an observer, not as a participant. But the statement also hints that Marcello plans to conform to the new dominant party, whatever it may be, to embrace the prevailing political system that will replace the fascists. He meets Italo on a Roman bridge near the Castle Sant'Angelo, an ancient prison, and he immediately removes the blind man's incriminating fascist pin. As they walk under the Colosseum, a place where the homeless and prostitutes gather, Marcello hears by chance the voice of Lino. The ex-chauffeur is trying to lure a young vagrant to his room with the promise of food, as he had earlier used various lures to bring Marcello there. Marcello hears Lino's familiar reference to Madame Butterfly, and he responds with fury. Have a look.
Perché non te ne vieni a mangiare a me? Anche a dormire. Se vuoi. Che belle scarpe che c'hai. Morbida. Un regalo. Pure te ne un regalo, un gatto siamese. Era buono. Un poco duro. Tengo un paio di scarpe camosce, è buono. E anche un bel kimono orientale, come quello della Butterfly. Ah, sai chi è Madame Butterfly?
Lino! Vi chiamate Lino voi?
Io? Sì, perché?
Non facevate l'autista? No?
Sì, ma tant'anni fa.
Già. Avevate una pistola, vero?
Io? Ma che volete dire?
Sei ancora vivo.
Ma io non vi conosco, voi che volete da me?
E cos'è quella cicatrice? Eh?
È stato un incidente.
Che incidente?
Ma insomma, chi vi conosce? Lasciate.
Dov'eri? Che facevi il 25 marzo 1917?
Io?
Ma voi chi siete? Siete pazzi? Cosa facevi il 25 marzo 1917?
Ma lasciatemi stare.
E il 15 ottobre 1938 dov'eri? Che facevi? Eh? Cosa facevi alle 4 del pomeriggio il 15 ottobre 1938? Lasciatemi, dov'eri? Ma che cosa facevi? Basta, lasciatemi! Io devo sapere! Lasciatemi! Assassino! Assassino! Ha assassinato un uomo! Un esiliato politico! Il 15 ottobre 1938! Il professor Quadri! Luca Quadri! E sua moglie! Anna Quadri! È un pederasta! Fascista! Il suo nome è Pasqualino... Marcello. Semirama! Pasqualino Semirama!
Marcello, te ne prego, sta zitto. Marcello, dove sei?
Fascista!
No, Marcello.
Anche lui
Che
è
cosa
fascista.
fai? Marcello.
Questo qui.
Ma che vuoi fare?
Questo qui era un fascista.
Marcello, Marcello, no. No, Marcello, ti supplico. No, Marcello, ma perché fai questo? Marcello.
Italo Montanari! Fascista!
Ma sei pazzo. Marcello, dove sei? Dove sei? Vieni qui. Vieni. Marcello.
Whatever relief Marcello might feel at discovering that he didn't kill Lino is overshadowed by his hatred of the man. He hates Lino most of all for awakening his own traumatic homosexual desire. Thus, he attacks Lino again, decrying him as a homosexual and citing the date of their encounter as proof. But now, rather than acting as a fascist, he accused Lino also of being a fascist, thereby making Lino a double scapegoat, both for his own homosexuality and for his own fascist involvement. And in classic scapegoat fashion, Marcello is eschewing sources of his own guilt by projecting them onto another and then driving him out. Indeed, Lino flees in terror. But even more egregiously and dishonestly, Marcello projects his guilt for the murder of Quadri and Anna onto Lino. He names the date of their killing in 1938. And in this frenzied, frightened disavowal, Marcello even betrays Italo, as he had betrayed Quadri and Anna earlier. He identifies his old friend as a fascist and then abandons the blind man as the socialist demonstration passes. It's notable here that this is a gesture of panic, a kind of panic of the sort that we saw when he fired the gun in that state of homosexual panic. Now it's both a homosexual and a political panic. Now, note that this demonstration of socialists is the same movement that several years before Marcello saw in Paris, but it is now in Italy, apparently, going to become the new political normal, the ideology to which Marcello must appear to adopt. But he's isolated at this moment as the demonstrators swarm past him, isolated in a way that recalls the way in which he was isolated even as being surrounded by the dancers in Paris. After the demonstration passes, Marcello sits alone in the dark. Have a look at the closing moment. In these closing images, Bertolucci draws together several of the film's motifs in a brilliant fusion. As the fire cast shadows in the cave-like darkness of the Colosseum, we're reminded of Plato's cave and the political delusions that men take for reality. Perhaps even the socialists are entertaining a political delusion. Certainly the fascists were. We know that Marcello, however, will accept whatever political shadows he needs to live. But unlike the chained cave spectators, Marcello knows that all politics is shadow play. It's all propaganda. It's all lies. As the music from a prostitute's phonograph drifts in the air, Marcello repeats a habit we've seen throughout the film. He looks over his shoulder, always fearful that other eyes might discern his difference. Metal bars frame him, reminding us that he remains forever trapped by his need to conform and also trapped by his past. And in these final frames, we see a red glow from the fire washing over Marcello's face. It brings us back to the film's expressionistic opening image in the hotel room, where the neon light outside washed him the color of blood, the blood that he would soon shed. Having shed that blood now and done so much else, there is no repression, there's no absolution, and finally there is no form of projection, it seems, that can ultimately ever remove the taint.